When tech mogul Harrison Whitmore's 8-year-old son, Marcus, stopped speaking to everyone in their Beverly Hills mansion except the quiet gardener who worked in their backyard, the billionaire thought it was just a phase. But what Marcus whispered to Jerome Washington every morning at 7 a.m. would expose a family secret so devastating that it would change everything Harrison thought he knew about his own life. This is the story of how a child's innocence revealed a truth that 3 generations had buried, and why sometimes the people we overlook hold the keys to our deepest mysteries. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitmore estate sat like a fortress of glass and steel against the Hollywood hills, its 47 rooms echoing with an emptiness that money couldn't fill. Harrison Whitmore had built his empire from a single software patent at 22, transforming a college dorm room idea into Nexus Technologies, now worth $12 billion. But success had come at a price he was only beginning to understand. Marcus Whitmore was 8 years old and hadn't spoken to his father in 6 weeks. Not since the morning Harrison had rushed past him in the marble foyer, phone pressed to his ear, dismissing his son's excited attempt to show him a drawing with nothing more than a distracted wave. The boy had watched his father disappear into his home office, the heavy oak door closing with a finality that seemed to echo through the cavernous house. What troubled Harrison most wasn't just the silence, it was the selectivity of it. Marcus chatted normally with Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had raised him more than his own parents ever had. He laughed with Miguel, the chef who made special pancakes shaped like dinosaurs every Sunday. He even engaged in lengthy conversations with Dr. Patricia Hayes, his private tutor who came 3 times a week to supplement his exclusive private school education. But Harrison? Nothing. Not a word, not even eye contact during their forced family dinners in the dining room that could seat 20, but only ever held 3 lonely figures at one end of its mahogany expanse. Harrison's wife, Vivian, had filed for divorce 8 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences in court documents that everyone knew meant married to a workaholic who cares more about market shares than marriage. She now lived in their Malibu house, seeing Marcus every other weekend per their temporary custody arrangement. During those visits, according to Vivian, Marcus spoke freely about school, his friends, even his frustrations with math homework, but never about his father. "He's punishing you," Vivian had said during their last tense phone conversation about Marcus's behavior. "Children don't just stop talking, Harrison. They stop talking to people who have stopped listening." Harrison told himself he was listening. He attended Marcus's soccer games when his schedule allowed, which admittedly wasn't often. He'd hired the best tutors money could buy, enrolled him in elite programs for gifted children, and made sure the boy wanted for nothing material. But somewhere in the relentless pursuit of building his empire, Harrison had lost sight of the small human being who shared his last name and lived in the same house. The only person Marcus seemed genuinely excited to see each day was Jerome Washington, the head groundskeeper who had maintained the Whitmore estate's extensive gardens for the past 3 years. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., Marcus would slip out of the house through the kitchen door and find Jerome beginning his work near the rose garden that had been Vivian's. Pride and joy before she left, Harrison had first noticed these morning meetings from his home office window, which overlooked the property's meticulously landscaped backyard. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see his son animatedly talking to the tall, weathered man who wore dirt-stained work clothes and moved with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that good things took time to grow. Jerome was 43. Though years of outdoor work had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He had the kind of steady presence that made people feel safe, speaking in measured tones that never carried judgment. He'd grown up in south-central LA, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. Through hard work and an associate degree in horticulture from Pierce College, he'd built a reputation as one of the most skilled landscape designers in Southern California. When Harrison had hired Jerome through an exclusive service that catered to high-end properties, he'd been impressed by the man's portfolio and professional references. What he hadn't expected was how quickly Marcus would gravitate toward the gardener, or how their daily conversations would become the highlight of his son's otherwise isolated routine. From his office window, Harrison watched these interactions with growing curiosity and, if he was honest, a twinge of jealousy. What could a groundskeeper possibly have to say that was so captivating to an 8-year-old boy who had access to every educational toy, video game, and entertainment system money could provide? The conversations always lasted exactly 15 minutes, ending when Mrs. Chen would call Marcus in for breakfast. Jerome would nod respectfully to the boy, hand him something, a flower, an interesting rock, and sometimes just a pat on the shoulder, and Marcus would run back to the house with more energy than Harrison had seen from him in months. Harrison had considered asking Mrs. Chen what she knew about these morning meetings, but something held him back. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe the growing realization that his 8-year-old son had formed a meaningful relationship with someone Harrison barely acknowledged beyond signing paychecks. Jerome had worked for the family for 3 years, arriving each morning at 6:30 a.m. in his weathered Ford pickup truck, methodically tending to the property's 12 acres of gardens, lawns, and water features. He worked alone most days, occasionally bringing in a crew for larger projects, but generally preferring the solitude and precision that came with solo work. Harrison had maybe exchanged 50 words with the man in all that time, brief interactions about sprinkler repairs or seasonal plantings that required approval, but Marcus had somehow seen something in Jerome that the rest of the family had missed entirely. The boy would position himself at the kitchen window each morning, waiting for that familiar truck to pull up the service road. The moment Jerome stepped out, tools in hand, Marcus would bolt from his untouched breakfast and race outside. What Harrison didn't know was that these weren't casual conversations between a lonely child and a kind adult. Marcus was sharing secrets, family secrets he'd overheard through late-night arguments between his parents, fragments of phone conversations that had confused and frightened him, observations about the locked rooms in their house that no one ever mentioned, and Jerome was listening with the patience of someone who understood that children often see truths that adults spend lifetimes trying to hide. He was also asking gentle questions, the kind that helped Marcus piece together details that, to an adult, would reveal a pattern the Whitmore family had worked very hard to keep buried. The morning Harrison decided to finally approach them both, he had no idea that his son's innocent trust in the family gardener was about to unearth a secret that would shatter everything he believed about his own identity and force him to confront a truth that 3 generations of Whitmores had died to protect. Harrison's decision to eavesdrop came on a Tuesday morning when the Los Angeles fog hung low over the hills, muffling sounds and creating an otherworldly stillness around the estate. He had positioned himself behind the gardening shed at 6:55 a.m., feeling ridiculous but driven by a desperation to understand what was happening to his family. Marcus appeared right on schedule, still in his Spider-Man pajamas, bare feet leaving wet prints on the dew-covered flagstone path. Jerome was pruning the climbing roses near the pergola, his movements methodical and sure. When he saw the boy approaching, his weathered face broke into the kind of genuine smile Harrison couldn't remember ever receiving from his son. "Morning, little man," Jerome said, setting down his pruning shears. "You're early today." "I couldn't sleep," Marcus replied, settling cross-legged on the stone bench nearby. "I heard Dad on the phone again last night. He was yelling at someone about papers and lawyers." Jerome nodded thoughtfully, pulling off his work gloves. "That sounds stressful. How did that make you feel?" Harrison tensed. This wasn't the casual conversation he'd expected. Jerome was asking the kind of probing questions that Harrison's own therapist, back when Vivian had insisted on marriage counseling, had posed. Scared, Marcus admitted, but also confused. He kept saying a name I'd never heard before. Theodore Blackwood. He said Theodore Blackwood's family won't get a single cent, and that the will was perfectly clear. Harrison's blood turned to ice. Theodore Blackwood was a name he'd hoped his son would never hear, a ghost from his family's past that his own father had warned him to never speak aloud. Harrison pressed himself closer to the shed, straining to hear every word. Jerome was quiet for a long moment, the kind of careful pause that suggested he was processing information rather than simply listening. That's a very specific thing to remember, Marcus. Was there anything else about this conversation that stuck with you? Dad mentioned Grandpa Charles a lot. But that's weird, because Grandpa Charles died when I was little, and Dad never talks about him anymore. He said something about how Grandpa Charles made sure the secret stayed buried with the right documents. Harrison felt his knees weaken. His father, Charles Whitmore, had indeed died when Marcus was 3, taking with him a family secret that Harrison had been grateful to leave buried. But now, through an 8-year-old's innocent recounting, that secret was being unearthed by someone who had no business knowing it. Marcus, Jerome said gently, have you ever heard your father mention anything about adoption papers? Or maybe old family photographs that seemed important? The question hit Harrison like a physical blow. How could Jerome possibly know to ask about adoption papers? Those documents were locked in a safety deposit, box that only Harrison and his attorney knew about, papers that revealed a truth so damaging it could destroy everything. The Whitmore name represented this. A locked room upstairs, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Dad thinks I don't know about it, but I've seen him go in there when he thinks no one's looking. Once I peeked through the keyhole and saw him looking at old pictures and crying. Jerome leaned forward slightly. What kind of pictures? Old ones, black and white. There was one woman holding a baby, and she looked kind of like you, Jerome. I mean, she had the same smile. And there were papers spread all over the desk, but I couldn't read them from the keyhole. Harrison's heart was pounding so hard he was certain they could hear it. The photograph Marcus had glimpsed was the one Harrison had inherited along with his father's confession. A picture of Dorothy Washington holding an infant in 1952, with the letter that explained how Charles Whitmore had paid her family to give up their newborn son to a wealthy white family desperate for an heir. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The adoption had been arranged through corrupt officials during an era when such transactions, though morally reprehensible, could be accomplished with enough money and influence. Charles Whitmore, unable to have biological children with his wife Margaret, had essentially purchased a light-skinned black infant and raised him as his own white son. The birth certificate had been forged, the record sealed, and Dorothy Washington had been paid enough money to disappear from Los Angeles forever. That infant had grown up to become Harrison Whitmore, never knowing his true parentage until his father's deathbed confession 30 years later. The revelation had shattered Harrison's sense of identity and filled him with a complex mixture of guilt, anger, and profound loss for a family and heritage he'd never known he'd lost. But Jerome's question suggested he knew far more than a groundskeeper should about the Whitmore family's history. And his last name, Washington, couldn't possibly be a coincidence. Jerome, Marcus continued, why do you think my dad gets so upset when he talks about old family stuff? And why don't we have any relatives who visit us? At school, all my friends have grandparents and aunts and uncles who come for holidays, but we never see anyone. Jerome was quiet for so long that Harrison wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Sometimes, Marcus, families have complicated histories. People make choices, some good, some not so good, and those choices affect everyone who comes after them. Your father might be carrying the weight of choices that weren't even his own to make. But that's not fair, Marcus protested. If someone else made bad choices, why should Dad have to be sad about them? You're absolutely right, little man. It's not fair at all. But sometimes the people we love carry burdens that are too heavy for one person to handle alone. Maybe your dad needs help carrying his burden, but he doesn't know how to ask for it. Harrison realized with startling clarity that Jerome wasn't just a gardener who happened to be a good listener. He was someone who understood the specific weight of family secrets, someone who asked exactly the right questions to uncover exactly the right details, someone whose presence in their lives might not be the coincidence Harrison had assumed. The morning conversation ended, as it always did, with Mrs. Chen calling Marcus for breakfast. But as Harrison watched his son skip back toward the house, he noticed Jerome pulling out his cell phone and dialing a number. The conversation was brief, but Harrison caught a few words that made his blood run cold. Confirmed, DNA, and grandmother's dying wish. When Jerome walked back toward his truck to retrieve more tools, Harrison stepped out from behind the shed. The two men locked eyes across the rose garden, and in that moment, Harrison saw something in Jerome's expression that confirmed his worst fears and deepest suspicions. Jerome Washington wasn't just any gardener. He was family. The family Harrison had never known he'd lost, the family Charles Whitmore had paid to disappear. And now he was back, using Harrison's own son to piece together the truth about an adoption that had stolen his rightful heritage and broken two families. Across 3 generations, the question that terrified Harrison most wasn't what Jerome wanted or how much he knew. It was whether the man who'd been so patient and kind with Marcus would show the same compassion to the son of the family that had erased his existence from their own history. The silence stretched between Harrison and Jerome for what felt like an eternity. 2 men separated by 30 feet of perfectly manicured lawn and 7 decades of buried truth. Harrison's hands were trembling from anger, fear, or recognition. He couldn't tell. Jerome stood perfectly still, his work gloves hanging from his belt, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. "How long have you known?" Harrison's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried across the morning air with crystal clarity. Jerome didn't pretend to misunderstand. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Since the morning I first walked onto this property and saw you through that office window. You have my great-grandmother's eyes and my Uncle Samuel's jawline. I've been staring at those features my whole life, in old family photographs. Harrison felt his legs give slightly, and he grabbed the edge of the gardening shed for support. So this was all planned? The job working here, getting close to Marcus? No. Jerome's interruption was firm, but not unkind. The job was legitimate. I answered an ad through Premier Landscape Services, just like any other contractor. But when I realized who you were, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. When I understood that you were Dorothy Washington's stolen son, I couldn't just leave stolen. Harrison's voice cracked on the word. My father told me it was an adoption. Legal papers, proper channels. Jerome let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Legal in 1952 meant whatever Charles Whitmore's money could buy. Do you want to know what actually happened, Harrison? Or are you more comfortable with the sanitized version your father fed you? Harrison found himself nodding before he could stop himself, even as every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to fire Jerome immediately, to protect the life he'd built from this inconvenient truth. Dorothy Washington was 17 years old and unmarried when she gave birth to you in the charity ward of County General Hospital. Your birth father was a jazz musician named Robert, who died in Korea before he ever knew you existed. Dorothy was working 3 jobs just to afford a room in a boarding house, but she loved you fiercely and never intended to give you up. Jerome began walking slowly toward Harrison as he spoke, not in a threatening way, but with the careful approach of someone delivering devastating news to a wounded animal. Charles Whitmore and his wife Margaret had been trying to have children for 8 years. They'd been turned down by every legitimate adoption agency in California because Margaret's medical records showed she was unstable. What we'd now call severe bipolar disorder. but then was just labeled as hysteria. No reputable agency would place a child with them. Harrison sank onto a nearby stone bench, his mind reeling. His mother, Margaret, had indeed struggled with what his father had always described as nerves and delicate health. She'd spent months at a time in private sanitariums, leaving Harrison to be raised primarily by a succession of nannies. So Charles went another route, Jerome continued, now standing just a few feet away. He hired a man named Vincent Torres, a lawyer who specialized in grey market adoptions. Torres found Dorothy through a network of informants who worked in hospitals, looking for vulnerable young mothers. The offer was simple, $10,000, enough money to start a new life anywhere she wanted, in exchange for her newborn son. She took the money, Harrison said flatly, surprised by the bitterness in his own voice. She was 17, alone and scared, Jerome replied sharply. Torres told her the baby would go to a loving family who could provide everything she couldn't: education, opportunities, a future she'd never be able to give you working as a domestic. He also told her that if she refused, he'd make sure she was reported to social services as an unfit mother, and you'd be taken away anyway, with no compensation and no guarantee of a good home. Harrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. So she had no choice, none at all. But Dorothy was smarter than Torres gave her credit for. Before she signed anything, she insisted on taking a photograph with you, just one. She also kept a lock of your hair and made Torres promise that if anything ever happened to your adoptive parents, she'd be contacted first about your welfare. Torres never intended to honor that promise, Harrison said. Understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. The papers Dorothy signed weren't legal adoption documents. They were essentially a bill of sale. Your birth certificate was forged to list Charles and Margaret as your biological parents. All records of your actual birth were sealed or destroyed. Dorothy Washington ceased to exist in your official history. Jerome pulled a weathered envelope from his jacket pocket. But Dorothy kept copies of everything. The real documents, the forged ones. That photograph, even a receipt showing the cash payment. She gave them to my grandmother Ruth before she died in 1967, with instructions to find you someday and tell you the truth. Harrison stared at the envelope as if it contained a bomb. Why didn't your grandmother come forward sooner?
She tried.
In 1975, when you graduated from Stanford, Ruth hired a private investigator to approach you. But Charles Whitmore's lawyers got to him first. They made it clear that any attempt to contact you or reveal the adoption would result in lawsuits that would destroy my family financially. Ruth was a widowed seamstress, raising 4 grandchildren on her own. She couldn't risk it. But she never gave up. Never. She researched your life from a distance, kept newspaper clippings of your business successes, even watched your wedding announcement in the Times. She died 2 years ago, but not before making me promise that I'd find a way to tell you who you really are and give you the choice she never had, the choice to know your real family. Harrison looked up at Jerome with new eyes, seeing not just the gardener who'd been patiently listening to his son, but a man who'd spent 3 years carrying out a dying woman's final wish with extraordinary grace and patience. Ruth was your grandmother. Dorothy was my great-aunt. Ruth was Dorothy's older sister, the one who tried to talk her out of giving you up and then spent the rest of her life trying to bring you home. Jerome's voice grew softer. She died holding that photograph of Dorothy with you, Harrison. Her last words were, "Tell my nephew he was loved from the moment he drew breath and every day since." Harrison felt tears he hadn't shed in decades burning behind his eyes. Marcus doesn't know any of this. Marcus knows his father is carrying a heavy burden and needs help. That little boy sees more than you think he does, Harrison. He sees a man who's lost and doesn't know how to find his way back to the people who love him. Jerome paused. Including the family you never knew was looking for you. Harrison finally reached for the envelope, his hands shaking as he held the weight of his true history. What do you want from me, Jerome? Money? An apology for what Charles did? Legal action, Jerome smiled sadly. I want what Ruth wanted and what Dorothy wanted before her. I want you to know that you weren't abandoned or unwanted. You were stolen from a family that loved you and spent 70 years trying to bring you home. What you do with that knowledge is entirely up to you." As Harrison clutched the envelope containing his real birth certificate, the photograph of Dorothy Washington holding him as an infant, and documentation of one of the most elaborate identity thefts in California history, he realized that his 8-year-old son had been right all along. Sometimes the most important conversations happen with the people who seem to matter least. And sometimes the answers we need most are hidden in plain sight, tended by patient hands in a garden where truth grows slowly but inevitably toward the light. Harrison spent the next 3 days locked in his home office. The contents of Jerome's envelope spread across his mahogany desk like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a life he'd never known he'd lost. The photograph of Dorothy Washington holding him as an infant had been taken at County General Hospital on March 15, 1952, his actual birth date, not the March 20th that appeared on his forged documents. Dorothy had been beautiful in the way that 17-year-old girls are beautiful, full of hope despite impossible circumstances. In the black and white photograph, she gazed down at the baby in her arms with such fierce tenderness that Harrison could feel it across 7 decades. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Dorothy Mae Washington and baby Harrison Robert, born 6:47 a.m., 8 lbs 2 Oz. Perfect in every way." His middle name wasn't Charles, as he'd always believed. It was Robert, after the jazz musician father he'd never known existed. The forged birth certificate was a masterpiece of 1950s document fraud, complete with fake hospital seals and signatures from doctors who had likely been paid handsomely for their participation. Beside it lay the real certificate, bearing Dorothy's signature and listing her address as a boarding house on Central Avenue, in what was then the heart of Los Angeles's black community. But it was the letter that destroyed him completely. 5 pages of Dorothy's careful handwriting addressed to "My precious son, wherever you are." She had written it in 1965, when Harrison would have been 13, and entrusted it to Ruth, along with the other documents. The letter spoke of her life after the adoption, how she'd used Charles Whitmore's money to put herself through nursing school, how she'd eventually married a kind man named William Crawford and had 3 more children, how she'd never stopped wondering if her first son was happy and loved. She wrote about the guilt that consumed her, the dreams where she heard a baby crying and woke up reaching for arms that held nothing. She described watching white families at parks and grocery stores, scanning every boy's face for features that might belong to the child she'd given away. She talked about the jazz records she collected, hoping that somewhere her son might hear his father's music and feel a connection he couldn't name. Most devastating of all, she wrote about forgiveness, not asking for it but offering it. She understood why her son might never want to know her, why learning the truth might bring more pain than peace. But she wanted him to know that every choice she'd made had been motivated by love. Even when love looked like letting go, Harrison read the letter 17 times before he could process that the woman who had written these words with such grace and wisdom had been forced to make an impossible choice at an age when most people are still figuring out who they want to become. On Thursday morning, he finally emerged from his office to find Marcus waiting in the hallway, still in his pajamas, clutching a drawing he'd obviously been working on for hours. "Dad?" Marcus's voice was smaller than usual. "Are you okay?" "Mrs. Chen said you haven't been eating, and Jerome asked me to give you this." The drawing was remarkably detailed for an 8-year-old's work. It showed 3 figures standing in a garden, a tall man, a shorter man, and a small boy. They were all smiling and holding hands. At the bottom, in Marcus's careful printing, it read, "Families can be bigger than you think." Harrison knelt down to his son's eye level, really looking at him for perhaps the first time in months. Marcus had his eyes, Dorothy Washington's eyes, and suddenly Harrison could see the genetic thread that connected 3 generations he'd never known he'd belonged to. "Marcus, what did Jerome tell you about families?" "He said that sometimes people get separated when they're too little to remember, but that doesn't mean they stop being family. He said love doesn't have an expiration date, and that it's never too late to come home." Marcus paused, studying his father's face with the intensity that only children possess. "Dad, are you lost?" The question hit Harrison like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so perfectly, devastatingly accurate. He'd been lost in work, lost in the pursuit of success, lost in a life built on a foundation that had never been real. "Yeah, buddy, I think I have been lost, but maybe it's time to find my way home." That afternoon, Harrison found Jerome transplanting seedlings in the vegetable garden behind the pool house. For a moment, he simply watched this man, who shared his bloodline work, with the same careful attention to detail that Harrison brought to software development. Jerome's hands moved with the confidence of someone who understood that growth required patience, proper conditions, and faith that something beautiful would emerge from what looked like nothing more than dirt and potential. "I read everything," Harrison said without preamble. Jerome looked up, soil still clinging to his gloves. And I need to know about the rest of my family. The ones who are still alive." Jerome's face broke into the first unguarded smile Harrison had ever seen from him. "There are 23 of us scattered between Los Angeles, Oakland, and Atlanta. Dorothy's 3 children, your half-siblings, are all still alive. Patricia is a retired teacher in Oakland. James runs a construction company here in LA. And Michael is a minister in Atlanta. You have 11 nieces and nephews, and more great-nieces and great-nephews than I can count." Harrison felt his chest tighten. "Do they know about me?" "They've always known. Dorothy told her children about the baby she gave up long before any of them had children of their own. She made sure they understood that somewhere out there they had a brother who might need them someday." Jerome pulled off his gloves and stood up. "Patricia has been hoping to meet you for 40 years, Harrison. She used to check the business journals to read about your company, proud as any sister could be. What if—" Harrison's voice caught. "What if they hate me? What if they think I should have found them sooner, or that I chose the Whitmore life over them?" "Family doesn't work that way," Jerome said simply. "Love doesn't work that way. Patricia, James, and Michael understand that you were a child who had no choice in what happened to him. They also understand that learning the truth as an adult is complicated and scary." Harrison looked toward the house, where he could see Marcus at the kitchen window, probably helping Mrs. Chen with afternoon snacks. "I don't know how to be part of a family, Jerome. I don't know how to be a father to Marcus, let alone a brother to people I've never met." "You don't have to know how," Jerome replied. "You just have to be willing to learn. And Harrison, you've got a pretty good teacher living right here in your house. That little boy of yours has been trying to show you how love works for months now." Jerome reached into his back pocket and pulled out a cell phone. "Patricia gave me her number 3 years ago, just in case this day ever came. She made me promise to call her the moment you were ready to hear her voice." Harrison stared at the phone as if it contained the power to reshape reality, which in many ways it did. One call would bridge a 70-year gap between a stolen child and the family that had never stopped looking for him. One conversation would transform him from Harrison Whitmore, isolated billionaire, into Harrison Robert Washington Whitmore, beloved brother and uncle to people who had carried his absence like a wound their entire lives. "What do I say to her?" Jerome smiled. "You say hello. You say you're sorry it took so long. And then you let her love you the way she's been wanting to for 70 years. Harrison took the phone with trembling hands, suddenly understanding why his 8-year-old son had found such comfort in talking to this man every morning. Jerome Washington didn't just tend gardens. He cultivated hope, nurtured truth, and had the patience to wait for the right season for everything to bloom. As Harrison dialed Patricia's number, he realized that Marcus had been right all along. Sometimes the most important conversations really do happen with people who seem to matter least. Until the moment when you discover they matter most of all. Patricia Washington Davis answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone for 70 years. "Is this my brother?" Her voice was warm and strong, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a woman who had spent decades teaching children to believe in themselves. Harrison's throat closed completely. He stood in the middle of Jerome's garden, holding a phone that connected him to a sister he'd never known existed, and found himself completely unable to form words. The silence stretched on, but Patricia didn't hang up. Instead, she began to hum, a low melodic tune that seemed familiar despite Harrison having never heard it before. "That's Summertime," she said softly when she finished. "Dorothy used to hum it to all her babies. Said it came naturally to her after your daddy played it so much on his saxophone. I've been humming it for you every year on your birthday, hoping somehow you'd hear it and know you were loved." "Patricia," Harrison finally managed, her name feeling foreign and precious on his tongue. "Oh, honey," she whispered, and Harrison could hear tears in her voice. "Oh, my sweet brother, I've waited so long to say your name out loud and know you could hear me." Harrison sank onto the stone bench where he'd sat just days earlier, learning his entire life had been built on a lie. But this conversation felt like the opposite of that revelation, not the destruction of false truth, but the construction of something real and lasting. "I don't know what to say to you," Harrison admitted. "I don't know how to do this. You don't have to know anything except that you're not alone anymore," Patricia replied. "Baby brother, you have never been alone. We have been here, all of us, waiting for this exact moment." Over the next hour, Patricia painted a picture of the family Harrison had never known. She told him about their mother Dorothy's life after the adoption, how she'd become a respected nurse at Cedars-Sinai, how she'd married William Crawford in 1956 and been loved completely for 34 years, until his death in 1990. She described their half-siblings, James, who had inherited Dorothy's fierce determination and built a construction empire that employed over 200 people, and Michael, whose Sunday sermons in Atlanta drew congregations from across the state. "Dorothy never got over losing you," Patricia explained, "but she channeled that loss into love for everyone else. She became the neighborhood mother, the house where kids came when they were hurt or hungry or just needed someone to listen. She fostered 12 children over the years, all of them knowing they had a big brother somewhere who would have loved them too." Harrison learned about family traditions he'd missed, Sunday dinners that had been happening every week for 60 years, with Dorothy's place at the head of the table never given to anyone else. Christmas mornings where his stocking was hung alongside everyone else's, filled with small gifts that were donated to children's charities in his name. Birthday celebrations where family members shared stories about what they imagined he was doing, creating a mythology around the lost brother who lived in their hearts. "We kept track of you through the newspapers," Patricia said. "When you started your company, James wanted to buy stock just so he could say his brother was making him money. When you got married, Dorothy cried for 3 days. Happy tears, she said, because her baby had found love. And when Marcus was born," Patricia's voice broke slightly, "when we read that birth announcement, Dorothy went out and bought the most expensive baby gift she could afford and donated it to the hospital nursery, saying it was from a grandmother who might never get to spoil her grandchild in person." Harrison thought about all the family moments Marcus had missed, birthday parties with dozens of cousins, holiday traditions that went back generations, the unconditional love of relatives who had been waiting 8 years to welcome him into their circle. "Patricia, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Harrison's voice was steady now, grounded by the reality of this connection he'd never imagined possible. "Are you angry? Any of you? That I had this privileged life while Dorothy worked 3 jobs? That I became wealthy while the family that actually wanted me struggled?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "Honey, let me tell you something Dorothy taught all of us kids. She said, Bitterness is a poison you drink hoping someone else will get sick. We were never angry at you, Harrison. You were a baby who had no choice in what happened. We were angry at a system that allowed babies to be stolen from families who loved them, but never at you." She paused, and Harrison could hear voices in the background, family members gathering, probably having been alerted that this long-awaited call was finally happening. "Besides," Patricia continued with a hint of laughter in her voice, "who says we struggled? James's construction company is worth more than most people make in 10 lifetimes. Michael's church has been featured in Architectural Digest twice. I may have been a public school teacher, but I taught at the most exclusive private academy in Oakland for 30 years. Half the tech executives in Silicon Valley went through my classroom." Harrison felt a surprised laugh escape him. "So we're all overachievers? Dorothy raised us to believe we could accomplish anything we set our minds to. Said she had to be extra proud of us to make up for not being able to be proud of you in person." Patricia's voice grew tender. "Turns out she was proud of you anyway. She had a scrapbook, Harrison. Every article about your company, every business award, every charitable donation Nexus Technologies made. She knew you were a good man raising a good son. And she was proud of who you'd become despite everything." By the time Harrison hung up the phone, 2 hours had passed, and the sun was beginning to set over the Hollywood Hills. Jerome had quietly continued his work nearby, giving Harrison privacy while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. Marcus had appeared at some point during the conversation, settling cross-legged on the grass to listen to his father talk to the family he'd just discovered. "Dad," Marcus said as Harrison finally ended the call, "you sound different." "Different how, buddy?" "Happier. Less scared." Marcus stood up and brushed grass off his jeans. "Are we going to meet them? Our real family?" Harrison looked at his son, this remarkable little boy who had somehow engineered this entire reunion, through his morning conversations with Jerome, and realized that Marcus had understood something profound that had taken Harrison 43 years to learn. Family isn't just the people you're born to or the people who raise you. Family is the people who choose to love you, who make space for you at their table, who carry your absence as carefully as they would carry your presence. "Yeah, Marcus, we're going to meet our family." Harrison stood up and put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Patricia is flying out from Oakland next weekend. She's bringing photo albums and a lot of stories about your grandmother, Dorothy." "Will Jerome be there too?" Marcus asked, looking toward the man who had spent 3 years patiently orchestrating this moment. Harrison and Jerome exchanged a look over Marcus's head, 2 men who had started as strangers and discovered they were bound by bonds deeper than employment or coincidence. "Jerome will absolutely be there," Harrison said firmly. "He's family too." As they walked back toward the house together, Harrison, Marcus, and Jerome, Harrison realized that his 8-year-old son had accomplished something that all of Harrison's business acumen, wealth, and connections never could have achieved. Marcus had brought everyone home. The Saturday afternoon, when Patricia Washington Davis walked through the front gates of the Whitmore estate, she carried with her 3 suitcases, a lifetime of stories, and the collective love of 23 family members who had sent messages, gifts, and prayers for their long-lost brother. Harrison waited on the front steps with Marcus, both of them nervous in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with the fundamental human need to belong somewhere. When Patricia stepped out of her rental car, Harrison saw his own eyes looking back at him from a face that bore the same strong jawline he'd inherited from their shared grandfather. But it was Marcus who broke the moment of uncertainty, running down the steps and straight into Patricia's arms, as if he'd known her his entire 8 years of life. "Are you my Aunt Patricia?" he asked, pulling back to study her face with the intensity children reserve for truly important moments. "I am indeed, baby boy," Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you are the most beautiful nephew I have ever seen. You look just like your daddy did in the pictures your grandmother Dorothy treasured." Harrison approached more slowly, decades of emotional armor making each step feel monumental. But when Patricia opened her arms to him, something inside him cracked open completely. The hug lasted several minutes, with Marcus wrapped between them, and Harrison understood for the first time what it felt like to be held by someone whose love had no conditions. No expectations, no hidden agendas. "Welcome home, baby brother," Patricia whispered against his shoulder, and Harrison finally understood what home meant. The next few hours transformed the Whitmore estate from a monument to isolation into something resembling an actual home. Patricia spread photo albums across the dining room table that had never held anything more meaningful than business dinners, telling stories that filled in 70 years of missing history. She showed them pictures of Dorothy at nursing school graduation, radiant with pride despite the sun-shaped hole in her heart. Photos of family barbecues where Dorothy would set aside the best piece of chicken for Harrison, wherever he is. Wedding pictures where Dorothy danced with joy, telling everyone who would listen that she knew her firstborn was happy somewhere and probably dancing too. Marcus sat transfixed as Patricia described his grandmother's Sunday ritual of playing jazz records and talking to Harrison's empty chair about her week, sharing news and asking for advice she'd never receive. She told them about the Christmas ornament Dorothy made every year with Harrison's name on it, and how the family had started a tradition of buying gifts from Harrison for children in foster care. "She never stopped being your mother," Patricia explained to Harrison. "Distance doesn't change love, and neither does time." But the most powerful moment came when Patricia pulled out a letter Dorothy had written just months before her death in 1995, a letter she'd asked Patricia to deliver if Harrison was ever found. Harrison's hands shook as he read his mother's final words to him, written in the careful handwriting of a woman whose hands had grown unsteady, but whose heart remained fierce. Dorothy wrote about forgiveness, not asking for it, but offering it completely. She forgave Charles Whitmore for stealing her son, forgave herself for being too young and scared to fight harder, and asked Harrison to forgive himself for any guilt he might carry about the life he'd lived. The letter ended with a promise. "No matter where you are or what name you carry, you are Dorothy Washington's son, loved before you were born and loved still. Come home when you can, baby. We'll be waiting." Jerome, who had been quietly preparing dinner in the kitchen while giving the family space for their reunion, joined them as the sun began to set. Patricia embraced him with the familiarity of family, thanking him for keeping his promise to Ruth and for having the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to bring everyone together. "You know," Patricia said as they gathered around the dinner table, the same table that had echoed with emptiness just days before, "Dorothy always said this family was like her garden. She planted seeds of love everywhere she went, trusting that someday they'd bloom into something beautiful." She gestured around the table, where Harrison sat between his son and his sister, with Jerome completing the circle. This is what she was waiting to see, her family whole again, even if she couldn't be here to witness it in person. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet during dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Dad, are you going to change your name back to Washington?" Harrison considered the question seriously. "What do you think I should do, buddy?" "I think you should be both," Marcus said with the wisdom that only children possess. "Harrison Washington Whitmore. That way you can honor the family who loved you and the family who raised you, and nobody gets left out." Patricia smiled across the table at her nephew. Dorothy would have loved this boy beyond measure. As the evening wound down and Patricia prepared to return to her hotel, she pulled Harrison aside for a private moment on the terrace overlooking the gardens, where Jerome had patiently cultivated truth alongside roses and vegetable seedlings. "Harrison, I need you to know something," she said. "James and Michael wanted to come with me, but we decided it would be better to let you get used to having one new family member at a time. But they're both hoping you'll bring Marcus to the family reunion in Oakland next month." Family reunion. Every year, the last weekend in August. This year will be the 71st annual Washington family gathering. Dorothy started it in 1953, the year after you were born. She said it was important to keep the family together, even with one missing piece. Patricia smiled. Especially with one missing piece. Harrison looked out over the estate that had felt like a beautiful prison just a week earlier. Now it felt like a home base, a place he belonged because he'd chosen to belong there, not because it was the only place he'd ever known. "We'll be there," he said without hesitation. 2 months later, Harrison Washington Whitmore stood in a park in Oakland, watching his son play with cousins he'd never known existed, while being surrounded by a family that had spent 7 decades keeping space for him at their table. Jerome was there too, officially recognized as the hero who had brought everyone together and unofficially adopted as the family member who had made the reunion possible. Marcus ran up to his father, grass-stained and breathless from a game of football with his teenage cousins. "Dad, Cousin David says next year we should have the reunion at our house in California. Can we?" Harrison looked around at the faces of people who shared his DNA, his history, and his future. He thought about Dorothy Washington, who had planted seeds of love that had taken 70 years to fully bloom. He thought about the morning conversations between a lonely boy and a patient gardener that had changed everything. "Yeah, Marcus," he said, pulling his son close. "I think that's exactly what Grandma Dorothy would have wanted." And for the first time in his life, Harrison understood that sometimes the most important conversations really do happen with the people who seem to matter least, until the moment when they help you discover that everyone matters most of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.